To engineering student at Western University for the past 10 years, where he also spent 7 years growing Western's research park into one of the largest and most successful technology incubation organizations in Canada, and a very important process in terms of research and industry for the university and the region around here. Certainly. He has also taught entrepreneurship to executives and professional engineers, enrolling master's programs at the University of Toronto, Waterloo, McMaster, and Queen's. He's an active champion of entrepreneurs and small business. Joel currently serves as chairperson of Downtown London's Revitalisation Board, chair of the London Area Wireless Networks Task Force, and is close to completing a personal quest to eat at over 700 restaurants in London, Ontario.
It's the important part of the bio.
How close are you?
1 or 2 left.
Okay. Mr. Adams established and I think this is also a very important step into multidisciplinary studies and entrepreneurship at Western. He was the first graduate and established the dual degree program between the Richard Ivey School of Business and Western Engineering, and was the founding president of the Western Engineering Organized Society. He is a member of many and diverse organizations in London and the region in many different aspects of social life and economic life, and I think that beyond his personal experience, which is, I think, very important in entrepreneurship and consulting, he's going to be able to bring together two difficult points of view or perspectives of experiences. The experience of having to do business in London with our limits and constraints and possibilities, but he also has the international and the national experience of his consulting work and of having dealt with international projects and ideas and innovations through Western's Research Park. So take advantage of his presence, and he will talk. You can interrupt him or ask him, and we'll have some time for discussion at the end. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. So I've got far more information than I can cover in the next 15 minutes, and I want to leave some time for questions. So do just dive in, ask me questions along the way if you'd like. I've got a couple things that will be interactive, and we'll dive right into it. Thanks for having me. Oh, and a slideshow, that works well. So I teach an entrepreneurship course from EK3. Anybody ever heard of EK3? They're a company based in downtown London. They've got a presence in Toronto and elsewhere as well. They were started by 2 graduate students here at Western. They were actually doing cognitive work based out of engineering, but also very much involved in psychology. So there was a nice bridge between science and humanities and engineering and the work they did. And they provide, they do the digital signs and a lot of the systems behind the signage you see at Tim Hortons and Walmart and RBC and McDonald's and TELUS and pretty much every big brand name you can think of that uses digital displays and digital technologies. That's all developed and created here, not just on the technology side, but also on the creative end of things. They produce the ads, but they're more than just pretty pictures on a screen. They're very much about trying to, engage, persuade, and so on with the users there. And they'll change content based on the weather. So if you go to Tim Hortons and it's very warm out, you're not going to see a lot of soup ads. If it's cold out, you'll see more, steaming bowls of soup on the screens above the menu board and so on. They also use it to promote a lot of the charity events and get awareness out that way. So Ken and I, for the last 10 years, have been developing this course in entrepreneurship and innovation that we generally teach to engineers, but there's a lot of similarities when you get into the arts and humanities, coming from a bit of a different perspective than sometimes the technology bias that you get in engineering, but then you inject sort of other biases into the mix. And that's really what our kind of course and discussion tries to break down. From our experience as entrepreneurs, neither of us are sort of real professors like the good professor here, but we try to bring both academic content in as well as personal experience and so forth. So I'm going to draw on a few topics from that. I'm going to cover things that probably I would normally take weeks to cover and try and engage you a little bit as well. So first off, what is entrepreneurship? Do you have any ideas what entrepreneurship is? Just a quick definition. Yep.
Seeking out opportunity for success.
Okay, I like that. Any other questions or any other thoughts?
Risk taking.
Risk taking. Any others? What do you usually think about when you think about entrepreneurs?
Well, taking opportunities with limited resources.
Okay, yep, that's a great part of it. Yes?
Being your own boss.
Being your own boss, so that independence. So we've got risk taking, we've got independence, we've got seizing opportunities, limited resources. So a good mix of items there. So here's a definition we pulled out of the academic literature, which is really a non-definition. It just kind of gave up on the whole thing. It said, well, there's lots of different kind of themes and traits, but there's no one specific definition. And this is another source. This is from a study done a few years back that looked at sort of typical traits of entrepreneurs. So commitment, determination, leadership, opportunity obsession, tolerance of risk. So some of the things that came up in the couple of comments there. Creativity, which ties into this course, motivation to excel. So a list of things here. But I would look at this very quickly and say these aren't just unique to entrepreneurs. Who else might have these traits? What does this look like? Does anybody here have these traits? Think about that for a second. We'll go through another list. Here I'll ask you questions at hand. So, who here is the offspring? Who are the kids of self-employed parents? Okay. You don't have to answer this next one. Who's been fired from more than one job? Okay. A couple people. All right. Child of an immigrant or an immigrant themselves? A lot of people. Has anybody ever worked for a firm with more than 100 people? So McDonald's in the summer, or big company on an internship. Who here is the oldest person in the family? Okay. And who here is a college graduate? A couple of us, hopefully. And hopefully a bunch of you in the months and couple of years to come here. So how many people answered more than two of these things with an affirmative hand up? Right, so a bunch of you did. These are typical sort of traits of an entrepreneur put together by Inc. magazine, pulled together by sort of different sort of studies and so forth. One of the things we find is that very often you'll be in a class like this and a lot of people have these traits, including people who kind of feel very, very clear that they would never be an entrepreneur. They don't have what it takes. They don't have that glint in the eye and the fire in the belly and stuff that they think needs to be there in place. Why do you think some of these things are typical traits? Why is working in a big firm a typical trait of an entrepreneur? That seems a little bit contraindicative. Any thoughts? Worked for a big firm? Exactly. Yep, so it sucks. I could do better. I got laid off from a job. This goes back to being fired. These things tie together. I got laid off from a job. I got fired from a job because I knew how to do this, but I had no mechanism within the bureaucracy of a larger company to be able to do that. So I want to be an entrepreneur. Certainly both inspiration from parents as well as learning certain tools and skills. Being an immigrant, you're starting out in a new place. Sometimes you have no choice but to be an entrepreneur. But very often, sometimes that's the reason why you came somewhere in the first place, was for opportunity. This is, I think, a bit of a statistical thing, but being an oldest child is also because we're the leaders in the family, right? Other oldest children? And then being a college graduate, there is sort of a skill set that comes into play here. This is something that I really strongly believe can be learned. And if we go back to these traits here, if you think about these for a second, I hope most of you have these. These are what it takes to be a successful, university graduate, or a successful, chair of a university program, or to lead up a nonprofit, or to be successful as a manager within a company, or to, run a museum, or to even be a successful artist in many cases. Maybe not every one of these things in the same measure, but a lot of sort of traits of successful people. I think there is really one set of perfect traits for someone who can be an entrepreneur. So this speaks to the definition that sort of came up in the discussion at first. Entrepreneurship, rapid growth of innovative businesses associated with individuals who create or seize business opportunities and go forward without resources under their control. So limited resources, and you need to get venture capital money, or you need to get partners, so you need to hire employees, you need to put together skills and bring in expertise that you don't necessarily have. That's being an entrepreneur. If you already have $1 billion and you just buy a business and set it up, not really entrepreneurial. It's really not necessarily starting from scratch. Sometimes you may have a lot of money, or you may have gone through other entrepreneurial ventures before, but it's always about taking on that extra challenge that's beyond your typical kind of thing. This is the definition that we really love, is a Peter Drucker definition. Entrepreneur is someone who gets something new done, which really ties it back to innovation as well, and a lot of the subject matter I expect you've covered in this class. It doesn't have to be about starting, a company or even making money necessarily. It could be starting an organization like Engineers Without Borders, or a new nonprofit, a club on campus, in my case a degree combination, probably one of my proudest entrepreneurial sort of pursuits. So getting something new done, but something important here is both the new part, but also the done. It's not just about thinking about it, not about the ideas, but really bring that innovation into the marketplace. So I'm going to actually skip over a bit of Drucker here and talk about innovation. You guys may have seen this quote before, and I know you'll probably talk about creativity in different ways, and I don't lean too much on definitions, but I do love this quote that really ties creativity and innovation together, but also distinguishes them. So creativity is thinking up these great, wonderful new things, and then innovation is really going forward and actually getting it out. In many cases, when I teach it and talk about it and do it, it's to the marketplace, it's in a business sense, but it can also be inspiring and impacting people in other ways. So I'm going to talk about 3 kinds of innovation, and I think you guys have probably covered some of these in the class already, so I'll go through them fairly fast, and certainly we'll leave the slides behind to share. So open innovation, disruptive innovation, and I think your very first class you talked about lean startups and lean canvas, but it ties into some of the other things that I'm talking about. So first off, has anybody read this book or come across it? So the concept of open innovation is really in opposition to this idea of closed innovation. Have you guys touched on this at all in the course? So traditionally, big companies, and even smaller companies in many cases, sort of think of innovation as a funnel. Lots of ideas on this end, and then ultimately one idea gets implemented as an innovation to the marketplace, or one idea has some impact on the world in a way. Lots of bad ideas and even good ideas get thrown out along the process. And that's a pretty important process that happens, but it isn't sort of the whole picture. There's lots of good ideas that are out here that maybe aren't the top priority for the task at hand or for the company that's in charge of sort of delivering it, but they get lost in the mix. And they may not be revisited for years and years to come. And we've seen that time and time again. Something was invented somewhere, and it wasn't touched for decades because they focused on something else. And that wasn't a bad decision. In many cases, that's what they should have focused on as a business or an organization or an individual. But we lose things over here in this traditional kind of development sense. Open innovation turns that around a little bit. It still keeps that funnel. It doesn't disappear. But it recognizes that these companies have good ideas over here, and they can find other paths to the marketplace or other ways to make an impact. So companies may take these ideas and license them out. They may partner with smaller companies. They may encourage some of their employees to go out and become entrepreneurs themselves and take that idea further than the company itself ever would. And you as that employee working for that big company that sucks now suddenly goes, hey, this is kind of interesting. They'll actually, encourage me to take my idea, even though it doesn't fit with the rest of the company, and go do something interesting with it that has an impact. In some cases, that may come back to the company through licensing revenue. Maybe it starts a new division. In other cases, it's just sort of released to the wild. So it makes this whole process much more porous without eliminating that process entirely. It can also work. So Procter & Gamble, most of you guys probably know who Procter & Gamble is, and if you don't, you recognize a lot of these brands. But all of the products that are listed up here that you'll walk through and see in the supermarket today weren't actually developed by Procter & Gamble. They weren't originally Tide products and developed by the Tide team. They were actually developed through their Connect and Develop program that they created a few years ago. Up until about 10 years ago or so, all of the inventions at Procter & Gamble were invented by people at Procter & Gamble. But there's lots of other good ideas out there. No matter how big a firm you are, there's always more ideas outside of your firm than inside of your firm or any organization. So they recognized that and they developed a mandate. They wanted to get 50% of their new products coming from outside sources. So their employees weren't just in charge of developing their own ideas, they were also in charge of looking for other ideas. And these all come out of other companies that in some cases they ultimately even spun off again into something new. So there's actually a program where you can go on a website, you can send them your ideas, or you develop your own business and you can partner up with them. So there's a car wash chain that is linked up with Mr. Clean and is using that brand as sort of an extension of what it does. Magic erasers you guys see all over the place. White strips are pretty familiar products, Swiffer and so on. These are all things that came out of places other than P&G, and they've radically changed the way they think of innovation through this program. So a couple ways to deal with open innovation. Another type of innovation here is called disruptive innovation. Have you touched on Creighton Christensen a little bit? So the thing I love about it is it's this idea that great firms fail by doing everything right. So what are the right things that you're supposed to do in business? I know this is not a business class per se, but what do you grow up thinking about? You want to make money. And how do you make money? Well, you go for the biggest markets you can, and you try and get the highest margins, right? You sell products that cost very little and that you can charge a lot of money for. That makes a lot of sense. And when I say that can put blinders on you, it doesn't mean to stop doing that. You should listen to your customers. You should go after big markets. You should look for products that you can generate, large margins on if you're generating things for a business or even a social enterprise that you're trying to make sustainable. However, these things can make you blind to certain opportunities. If you're always chasing sort of the lowest hanging fruit or the shiniest, biggest apple on the tree, you're not going to notice something else that can come and sneak up on you. This is actually an opportunity for you guys. If you were to become an entrepreneur, start something new, you can take on very, very large companies, very large markets by taking advantage of some of these blind spots. Or if you work for a larger organization, you need to be aware that these blind spots exist so that you don't get disrupted, lose your job because of what two people at the university went and started. So I'll talk about that description here. So here's one of your old-fashioned cable shovel excavators. Big, massive, earth movers with cables and machinery and stuff. Loud, noisy, break down, but get the job done. They can move a lot of dirt. And 50 years ago, if you wanted to move dirt in big quantities, this is what you used. So very quickly, not to make it too technical, we've got, like most charts, time on the bottom. And you have basically two markets that use those types of equipment. You've got one, sort of the pipe and sewer contractors that are just digging little trenches for residential projects. And then you've got big general contractors that are building dams and building entire houses, digging out foundation. And over time, like most things, those customers want more and more of whatever it is that they want, right? We want faster computers, we want a safer car, we want more of some particular feature to do with the product. We want all the features, but there's usually one thing that we zero in on. In this case, it's bucket size. So they want a pretty big bucket, be able to move as much dirt as possible. That's important. If they had a smaller bucket, they would never buy the product. If they had a bigger bucket, that would probably be good too, but they wouldn't pay a lot of extra money for it. This is sort of where they want to be. And over time, people tend to increase their expectations with most of these kinds of products. So, one of my other favorite books. Anybody read this? Okay, Are You My Mother? And this is what I always remembered as a kid. This is the big thing just said snort. Well, you're not my mother, you are a snort. I have to get out of here, said a little bird that was looking for its mother. So remember this snort, and what is it? It's one of those big cable excavators. So this book is fairly old, and I'm getting older and older. And apparently people who put up their hands have maybe parents that have a copy of this. So let's call this a snort. So a snort is one of these big cable excavators that moves lots of dirt in one fell swoop. And over time, the snort companies make these things bigger and bigger because their customers want them bigger and bigger. And they make them big enough that both of their target markets can use them. The small guys and the big guys. They probably make some smaller ones that fit in here, and they make some larger ones for customers that want them, but on average they make them probably somewhere along here. And as their customers demand more, they keep on improving them over time. That's innovation, right? Well, along comes the hydraulic shovel, and it's only a tenth of the size of a snort. So do any of the snort customers buy hydraulic shovels? None of them are interested in this. They're just tiny little things. What would you call a tiny little thing when you want a really big thing? Just dismiss it? I would call that a toy. Right? So what good is a little tiny hydraulic shovel when you're trying to build dams and foundations? You'd have to buy 10 or 100 of these things to do the work of one of your big cable excavators. Now it's true, they don't break down as much, they're faster, they're more compact. These are all good features. But if they're tiny little toys, it doesn't matter how wonderful they are in all these other ways. They're going to be useless for the task at hand. So you keep buying snorts and you keep on getting bigger and bigger snorts because you want to move more earth, and these are pretty useless to you. They're a tenth of the size or even a hundredth of the size of what you want. Nothing but a toy. However, just like the snort, the toy manufacturers are improving their product down here. They're making it bigger and better over time. And what you'll start to see is that very often these things progress at the same rate. New materials, new processes, new types of innovation may be adopted by both at the same kind of rate, and innovation improves at the same rate. But you'll start to notice something with this graph here. The gap closes here because no one actually knows where these gray lines are. People just say, I want a faster computer. And you don't really know what that means. How fast? Twice as fast, 3 times as fast, 20% faster. You want a faster computer. And the companies have to kind of guess what you want, and they deliver that to you. But very often, they end up giving you a hard drive that is like 8 terabytes, and you only need 200 gigabytes of it. And yeah, you wanted a bigger hard drive, but you really didn't need that much capacity. You weren't exactly sure, but they tried to give you more because you asked them for it. Oops. And so suddenly what happens is that the company here, the little toy company, finds a use that nobody else had thought about before. So this is 50 years ago in the 1940s. The first hydraulic shovels weren't used to excavate foundations and pipes and sewers. They were to be used on the farm so that the farmers' kids could go to school and they can go out there and dig fence posts and everything else. Whole new market. These people would never have bought one of those big snorts for tens or hundreds or millions of dollars. But they would buy something like this they can fit in the back of their tractor. To the big companies, that's still just a toy. It's not a threat to them. They've never sold to farmers. And why would I ever sell to farmers? I'd have to knock on all these doors, get a 10% commission for this tiny little device when I can sell to big contractors and make lots of money. My 10% commission could be worth, more than what I would make an entire year selling these tiny little, tractor things here. But of course, it keeps on getting better. So over 10 years, it improves, and they start selling to residential contractors. Whole new market that would never buy a snort. They wouldn't even know how to use these things, but they can find a use for this. So they're just doing small jobs, digging fences, that type of stuff. Suddenly, they come up with one you can stick in the back of the truck. Now you can dig a swimming pool out with this thing, maybe even do a foundation. And remember, it's a lot more reliable, it's faster, it's easier to use, and there's a lot of other advantages. More innovation. And notice both of these are probably innovating at similar rates, but these guys are just kind of getting, beyond even what their customers are asking for. Suddenly, they're good enough. They're not better than these. These are still much better, they're still much bigger, but they're good enough to meet their minimum need here. Everybody starts buying these from these little tiny companies that started up over here. And these companies never got into that business because they didn't see it coming. They saw that as a toy business. Why would we waste our time there? So this is a bit of a lesson for these big companies to watch out for things sneaking under the radar. These little toys, don't dismiss them. But for you guys, if you think about being an entrepreneur, and it doesn't have to be just technology, if you think about being an entrepreneur and introducing new innovations to the marketplace or new innovations that can have impact on the world around you, go after these smaller markets. Be a toy. Look at something that maybe isn't perfect. Don't try to be a copy of something big. And what Clayton Christensen's found is that time and time again, whenever you go after the big guys, if you came out with one of these and you waited 20 years and tried to enter this marketplace, you would lose against them every time. And does anybody know why?
Is there more purchasing power?
Absolutely. They'll be able to, buy things at a cheaper price than you. They could go buy your engineers from you and, have them reinvent it. They could tell people that it's an unsafe product. They've got a lot of power that way. And they'd be motivated to do that because if you start going after this marketplace, you're taking their lunch. Literally, their salespeople are trying to sell these things. Their engineers, their managers, their designers are trying to make things here for their customers, and you're going after that marketplace. They're going to react very strongly. If you start selling things to people that they don't even know exist, they're not going to even notice you until it's too late. And that's the opportunity and why you see a lot of these small companies sneak up on the big companies all the time. And later on, you see these guys out of business, and all of the companies that used to make these big cable excavators are out of business. They used to be large multinational companies 50 years ago. None of them exist, and all the people that make these are mostly companies that either didn't exist or weren't in this marketplace 50 years ago. So that's an opportunity for you guys. Something new. And of course, there's things that have followed that. I won't go through these, but you probably know some of the examples like Toyota and Honda that started out with little motorcycles and little third cars for someone going to school, and then a second car, and then ultimately, I know professors who, were students who drove a small Honda or a Toyota, 20, 30 years ago, and then their first car when they graduated was one that was a little bit better, and then the first car when they had kids was one that was, able to handle 4 people, and now today they drive a luxury Toyota, and they've kind of basically had the same car for 30 years, but the car's improved with them. And originally, no one was really concerned about Toyota coming over to North America. They were just little cars for, maybe the teenager or something. So all kinds of examples that I can touch on through some questions if we have a few moments. So I know you guys have already covered a little bit of this in terms of lean startups, but I want to think about this concept called the minimal viable product a little bit. So I just talked about how being a toy, developing something, getting it out there before it's fully proven, before it's going to kind of take on the big boys. When I hear someone say, I've got an idea and it's twice as good as anything out there, I tell them to run away from that idea, because it's just going to go after somebody else's lunch. If they say, I've got an idea, and one day it can be twice as good as anything out there, but today I think I can develop a whole new customer that no one is even talking to, and I can grow my market and work out the bugs and work out the kinks with them and move it along, that's something that's exciting to me. That's something nobody else is going to try and steal that business from you, because they don't even see it as a business opportunity. And that's really in lean product development or lean startup development, this idea of a minimal viable product. Get kind of the basic essentials out there to your customer. Don't spend the next 3 years developing your idea and perfecting it, and then suddenly giving it to people and they go, that's not really what I want. And you've just wasted 3 years of your life. Get the very basic thing out there to a small customer group who you can learn with, that you can learn from, and then develop the tweaks. And you'll find out, like Twitter did, Twitter started out as a dating service. And nobody liked the dating service, but they liked the messaging component of the dating service. And so they pivoted and they turned into what Twitter is today. And there's a lot of companies that have done that recently. They come out with a very, very basic, minimal viable product, just what's needed. Even Google started out that way. There is no Google News or Google Earth or Google Maps. They didn't even have advertising. They just had a search bar and a button. Kept it really simple, learned what the customers wanted, and over the series of a course of years, they were able to develop a product and develop into a very large, significant company. Even though when they launched, there was 20 other competitors that were significantly larger than what they were. So you learn from the marketplace, and then decide, do you pivot or do you keep going in the direction that you started from? And so all along, the other nice thing about this is it means you can start new ideas, you can launch new things without spending a whole lot of money. You don't need to raise millions of dollars to get a new idea out there. Sometimes you don't even need to do anything. You just need to, Airbnb, who's used Airbnb before? Anyone? You know who Airbnb is? So Airbnb, you can go online and you can find, that spare room that someone isn't using for 20 bucks. Pick that up. It gets, the person gets verified. There's reviews and everything. They started initially testing that by just doing postings on Kijiji. So they didn't even need to have a website or any programming or developers or spend any money at all. They tested the concept using other people's tools. And that's the idea of this minimal viable product. And no one's going to be threatened by that. Hotels are going to say, people posting things on Kijiji about sleeping on somebody's couch, that's not a problem. But today, Airbnb processes more rooms than all of the hotels in New York combined. And I think it's actually significantly more than that. They're doing $1 billion or more in transactions every year out of something that started out with just a couple posts on somebody else's website.
Well, I have a question about the persevere. How do you decide about that? When it's about some measurements that you are following, some key metrics, or because if you have mentors, every single person has a different idea about something which is successful yet, and they will tell you go this way, go the other way, and so you always have this dilemma about should I continue, should I change, should I leave it?
It's tough. So on the one hand, some of the lean startup is really based on this idea of like A/B testing and very metric heavy. So you launch a website, and then if you actually develop 2 versions of your website with slightly different changes. So there's a buy now button at the top and a buy now button on the bottom. And depending on who comes to your site, I'll go to it and I'll see the thing at the bottom, and your professor goes to it and he sees the thing at the top. And they find out that the people with the thing at the top, twice as many people end up buying the product as the people with the button at the bottom. So you switch the site to the button at the top. And you can do that for product changes as well. And there's a lot of companies that do that quite successfully. And you can be really rigorous about that, right? So you can just base, if 51% of the people like this and 49 like this, then we can go that direction. On the other hand, I read just a couple days ago, Mark Zuckerberg, when he was offered $1 billion for Facebook in 2006 by Yahoo. They offered to buy him for $1 billion. They had $30 million in revenue. They were a relatively small company. They were only at, I think, 19 different universities. It was before Facebook was open up to everybody. And this is a pretty significant offer. You're 22 years old, you're offered $1 billion for the company you started in your dorm room a couple years ago that only makes $30 million and actually loses money in terms of profitability. Well, of course you accept that offer, right? But he actually asked himself, and he told his investors, they said, you can do a lot with your share of $1 billion. What would you do with $1 billion? He said, I would start another social network company. And I kind of like the one I already have. And I don't think Yahoo knows how valuable this is. I think they're going to mess it all up. I would rather keep on doing this as opposed to getting $1 billion and having to start all over again from scratch. So this is maybe a terrible answer to your question, but it really depends. But I think some of it comes down to the entrepreneur themselves. So I think you use these metrics at the very early stages to kind of find your right business model, to throw out the things that don't work. But you have to stick to your guns at a certain point. You believe in the solution, you have a certain expertise, you can't let go of that. So I think some companies and some products lend themselves very well to just letting the numbers dictate these decisions and setting up a hypothesis in advance and saying, if at least 60% of the people like this, we're dropping everything else and we're doing this. In other cases, you may find out that a lot of people don't like what you're doing, but you still think that this is where the future is going, and you take that risk anyways. And Facebook tends to do that, right? They piss off all their users all the time, right? They get rid of the feeds, they change the wall, they change the settings. Everyone complains, I'm not going to use Facebook anymore. And then 6 months later, they've got more people using Facebook. Even some people left, but that's okay. They kind of are sticking to their guns. There's other businesses that are very focused on listening to the customers and dictating stuff, and they'll change back very quickly. So it's a tough thing. But I think knowing both of those extremes and being able to identify when you are ignoring customers and when you're listening to customers is the first step towards being successful. So just a quick summary. And what time is it? 8 after. 10 after? Okay, so a little bit of time here. So just quickly in summary, entrepreneurship is management. It's a process. It's something that I believe very strongly that you can learn. Regardless of what your background is, whether you're an engineer, whether you're in humanities, whether you're in sciences, whether you're a hairdresser starting a new salon. There's ways to make anyone a better entrepreneur with the right opportunity that fits your interests. And innovation is really a tool, right? You don't have to innovate all the time, but for the entrepreneur, that's that new thing that you're getting done. And there's processes that can help you along the pathway of innovation. So it's exciting to me that you guys are taking this course, taking this program, because it's really all about, the real basics and fundamentals, I think, of creativity and innovation, which are very important. They're very repeatable processes. You'll look back at innovations through hundreds of years, and you'll be surprised at how people didn't see something coming. You guys take a course like this and a program like this, you'll be able to see these things coming ahead of other people, even the engineers like me that might be developing them. Sometimes especially, you'll see them before people like me. Ideas are everywhere, but the thing is, there's 7 billion people on the planet. If you've got a company, even in New York City, on average, there's 7 billion other people with their ideas outside of anywhere that you are. And you've got to accept the fact that anything you come up with has been thought about somewhere else, and there's probably even better ideas elsewhere. How you can tap into those is as important as being creative and coming up with them on your own. And then ultimately, things change. Be disruptive or be disrupted. And if you are, developing a product, you're Facebook, think about MySpace, think about Yahoo a couple years back. They get disrupted by Google, they get disrupted by Facebook, just 1 or 2 entrepreneurs starting a company. It is going to happen eventually, but you can be adaptive, you can see these things coming. Or if you're just starting out, don't be afraid of these big companies, but don't go after their lunch. Be a toy, don't be a snort. If there's anything I want you to walk away from this class, that's the most important lesson of today. So minimal viable products, I'm not sure if you've touched on the concierge minimal viable product. That's sort of like that Airbnb using Kijiji. They didn't have a product, they didn't have any kind of programming. They just kind of faked their way through it to find out whether people liked it or not. So the concierge minimal viable product is like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. There isn't really a wizard there, but he's blowing smoke, there's fire, and you don't want to sell a product like that ultimately. You want to actually build a great product that people love, but you don't know what people are going to love. So instead, sometimes you'll see some of these startups, they'll post ads, they'll ask people for down payments. Kickstarter and Indiegogo are a lot like that, right? And they're very transparent. They don't pretend they have a product that they don't, but they say, I'm going to build this great thing, or I'm going to have a Veronica Mars movie if I can get 4 million people to invest in me in the next 2 days. These kinds of things are really selling not even a minimal viable product, but something that isn't even existing, but they're able to test people's demand for it. And if 4 million people in a couple days invest in a Veronica Mars film project, well, there's probably a whole lot of people that didn't invest who would also watch it and go to the movie or watch it on TV or buy the DVD. So it gives you a real sense of what the market wants to do. Innovation is really doing new things. So it's not just about thinking about stuff, writing a business plan, spending the next 4 years kind of debating it. Get out there. Lean startup events, startup weekends are great inexpensive ways to learn how to launch a business in like 24 hours, 48 hours, 54 hours. And you can go through and learn a lot through those kinds of mechanisms. So go build stuff and keep on learning. And we can chat for a few minutes, and I'm going to pop up another couple slides too that I thought may be of interest today. I'll give one more example here on the concierge minimal viable product. This comes from Eric Ries in the Lean Startup book. And so there was a company developing an application, and tell me if this sounds like it would be interesting to you. You guys are busy students, but you want to try and eat a little bit more nutritiously. You're eating craft dinner every night, and you want to eat a little bit better. So they developed a product. They wanted to develop a product that would be a service that would match you to nutritional recipes that were developed based on your tastes, your interests, your nutritional requirements. And they would develop a list of ingredients that you would go out and buy every week from local stores. So they would be things that would be in stock. They would give you a price and tell you how much it's going to cost. And every week you would get a new list. You'd go to the grocery store, you'd buy everything on the list, and then through the week you'd still cook and stuff. But it would be that much easier because you'd have everything you need, at hand. You don't have to go back to the grocery store to get that, extra thing of milk or flour or whatever else. They've developed a list for you. Nice matchmaking service for someone that wants to cook but doesn't have the time to be driving back and forth to the grocery store all the time or looking up new recipes and finding out what they like. They'll actually match your things based on things you liked before, and you have a rating system and everything else. So there's a problem with this, is that the grocery stores don't like to share their information. And you may be able to populate it through like crowdsourcing and through people entering things on their own, but that's going to take years to build up that kind of database. And it might cost you a lot of money to try and negotiate with all the grocery stores to get all the information on what stuff they have in stock. The grocery stores don't even know. They may not even have the back-end systems that do that. So this is something that could cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to develop. Forgetting about even the artificial intelligence to be able to tell what you like and what you don't like and what's nutritional for sort of your particular needs. So this is a very, very complex problem. So they started with a single person. What they did is they got a nutritionist, they got a couple of chefs, they got a couple of buyers, and they identified a perfect target customer for them. So this is not a statistically valid sample of 100 or 1,000 or 10,000. It's a single person. And what they did is they came over to their house and said, so what do you like? What kind of foods do you like? What kind of foods don't you like? What are your nutritional goals? And then the chefs came up with recipes. And then the buyer went to the grocery stores and identified which grocery stores had the ingredients. And then they came back 2 days later and said, here's your list. Is this a good business? This is a terrible business, right? It's wonderful for the customer. Imagine having 2 executive chefs, a nutritionist, and personal buyers going out there identifying what you should be cooking. That's pretty cool. But are you going to make money doing this? Not at all. They didn't charge the person anything. But the idea was to say what the person liked and what they didn't like. And suddenly by talking to that one single person, they found out that they didn't want to make a meal every single night because their kids have soccer practice on Thursdays. And sometimes they stay late at work and they just pick up something on the way home. And then all that food that they bought goes bad. So now suddenly they go, okay, before we launch this thing, let's not make it a 7 days a week, 3 meals a day, 28 recipes a week kind of thing. Let's scale it back to a certain number of meals with interchangeable components. So they're able to start to modify the idea before they even had a working prototype or even hired any programmers to develop what they wanted to be like a web-based app. So that's your concierge minimal viable product. It's very much a toy in the sense it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, and it's also a terrible business in that it's going to cost you, 5 salaries to deliver a product that someone might pay $20 a month for. But it gets you going, it gets you that feedback. And that's why innovation is really going out there and doing stuff. So, I wanted to ask me at all. Yep.
You showed a few books up on education. I was just wondering if there's any books that you found particularly impactful in terms of entrepreneurship or your business.
Number one book that I recommend, I do like the Lean Startup. Actually, I'll back up. Generally with business books, read the first 3 chapters and then stop reading, because really what they did is they wrote an article once, they added a couple extra chapters to it, and then they added a bunch of extra chapters to it because they had to sell it as a book. And by and large, you can get everything you need to know in the first 3 chapters and then kind of skim the rest and see if there's some nice charts and stuff that kind of capture everything. That's just a general kind of rule. That being said, I really do like The Lean Startup by Eric Ries and Running Lean, which I actually may have both of them in my bag. Running Lean by Ash Mayura, which really capture the lean startup concept, the lean canvas, and everything else very nicely. And they are good books to read from beginning to end, and they're very easy reads. So you pick up a lot of good information, they're quick reads, and so on. The book that, on a technology kind of basis, that captures a lot of great ideas and that is worth an entire read with a caveat is Crossing the Chasm. All about launching new products into the marketplace, being adopted, and very often you'll see products or even innovations. I do a lecture about about scurvy, right? People die from scurvy on all these ships for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's from diffusion of innovations, and they discovered hundreds of years ago that just a little bit of lime in the water, which is why they called the British Empire the Limeys, they put lime in their water and didn't die of scurvy, and then were able to conquer the world. But they discovered that hundreds of years ago. Anyone could use that information, but it took hundreds of years for people to actually adopt that. And most innovation falls into a trap called the chasm. And Jeffrey Moore wrote a book called Crossing the Chasm that you'll find in every single bookstore pretty much anywhere. even used bookstores, you're likely to find it's probably one of the best, probably one of the top 5 best-selling business books of all time. Very useful if you go into Silicon Valley or a technology company and they've got 3 books up on the shelf. One of them is probably Crossing the Chasm. If there's one book, it's probably Crossing the Chasm. I think it was one of the 3 books that Jobs would refer to all the time, along with Mucus-Free Eating or something. But you can also, if you want to cheat, you can read the follow-up book, Inside the Tornado, and it summarizes the first book in the first 3 chapters. But there's useful information in both of those. It focuses a little bit more on how you get to the next step once you're successful, but you have to keep on building more and kind of running fast. Disruptive innovations, the ones that I mentioned here, and you guys will have the slides. They're both recommended. And then the other thing is that there's a lot of good books out there, a lot of like the biographies. Don't read anything by Donald Trump. His dad had a $5 billion business, and he turned it into a -$5 or -$2 billion business. He's probably one of the least successful entrepreneurs of all time, but one of the most successful personal marketers. So if you want to build a personal brand, read Donald Trump. If you want to learn about business, he knows very little bit about business, and probably even less about real estate. And this is going up on the web, so. But those kinds of books are still interesting, they're inspirational, but they might not translate to you. Just because they did that, they may have just been lucky 5 times in a row, because there's 7 billion people on the planet. There's going to be millions of people that are lucky 5 times in a row, that are going to roll the dice and are going to get 7s every single time for 10 times. So you have to be a little bit careful reading biographies. Let them inspire you, but don't copy what they did.
Okay.
So, yep.
Can you touch again on your point on you had one book there where it said there's ideas everywhere, but people are smarter than you and not invented here. I kind of missed that. So what is the foundation of your point?
So a lot of companies and even individuals, right? You've got this great idea. You've been thinking about it for years. You think it's wonderful. You tell people about it, and they go, "That's a terrible idea." Well, you ignore them, and maybe that's okay for Mark Zuckerberg ignored $1 billion and said, "No, my idea is bigger than that." So sometimes you have to stick to your guns. But on the other hand, a lot of businesses, these big businesses, they'll hire all these smart people. And they'll hear ideas from small entrepreneurs and say, well, no, that doesn't really, our customers don't care about that. It's not really that they don't care about that, it's that they're focused on the things that they're inventing. They're proud of their work, which is fine, but that creates blind spots. So always try to remember, be humble, and try to recognize the fact that there are other people out there with great ideas. And there's probably someone that's tackled the same problem that you're tackling and has solved it in a different or more interesting or even better way. But they may not have the customer that has that requirement. So it may be sitting on a shelf somewhere. So you may try and find ways to reach out and get those ideas in. So Procter & Gamble did that in a big way. They created a whole program. They reached out to inventor associations, to small businesses, and really promoted that. It's hard to find those ideas when they're sitting on a shelf, but it's important to recognize that they do exist out there. So I don't know if that helps. I'm going to pop up just a bunch of pictures here. See if I can pull this a little bit here. So I'm going to go through this really fast. You guys, I saw one of your readings, and I don't know how caught up you are on them, but was The Secret History of Silicon Valley by Steve Blank. And I did this presentation. I love this. I can go without. Hustle now is awesome. This was from the Montreal International Startup Fest a few months back, or a year ago, I guess. So I did this presentation for the city. And you'll see lots of food pictures because I'm not just about innovation. But you'll see some innovation stuff. Hacker spaces like we have at the Research Park at the Unlab, but also down in California, Waterloo, Montreal, arts and so on. But I wanted to pop this up because I just happened to notice that this was on your syllabus. And this was actually me basically following that secret history of Silicon Valley while I was down there on a conference and had some other meetings in the Valley. So Stanford University is a beautiful, beautiful walkable campus, lots of bikes, a lot like Western, except it's always sunny. They've got their design school. You walk down the hallway and you just notice, hey, that's interesting, and it's Google's very first server. just sitting there in a glass cabinet. Very open environment. It's not all locked down. I've spent a lot of time in Boston through the years, less time in California. I love Boston. You can walk everywhere. It's like Montreal. It's a very walkable city. California is a car culture. So you do have walking environments like this at Stanford, across the street in Palo Alto. This is the emptiest Apple store in the world because everybody there already has everything in it, so nobody buys anything there. Which, of course, is across from Borders going out of business. So, but this is where the Silicon Valley started. It happened in a nice little kind of cottagey, upper-class residential neighborhood. That's the HP Garage, the original kind of garage startup. A few other big companies. This is where the Transistor came out of, and you could buy this house last year. Stanford Research Park. The thing here, though, as I start to get into, there's some nice walkable areas around the university, but California, even this part of California, is not a walkable place. It's not even that beautiful. There's nice kind of mountains and ocean in the background, but it's cold water. You can't swim there. There's big business parks. This is Facebook, and you got the people sitting on the lawn, and I think I saw Mark Zuckerberg go by on a skateboard and a hoodie. But you have a lot more places like this. HP with gates up. It's a pretty cold place with lots of industrial buildings, lots of parking lots. And as you guys look at Richard Ford and you learn about placemaking, the importance of place and geography, that's true. But geography and place isn't sufficient on its own. And sometimes even the most innovative places in the world are not the most amenable to, say, walking around. It's not all cafes and pedestrian culture. I found where the sidewalk ends, and it actually ends at Skype, which makes sense. But long, hot, pavement, very few skyscrapers. These are all the tall buildings in the valley. The rest are all basically suburban wasteland. And what that tells me isn't that you need suburban wasteland to innovate. I think it's really the exact opposite. But it's the fact that every place has sort of different dynamics. It's about the people there. It's about the culture that they create. And so they have, in these industrial parks, they have places like Hacker Dojo that have all kinds of creativity within them and that bring people together. They've got free buses that drive people around Palo Alto that Stanford offers. So they've got their zip cars all over the place. So even despite some of the geographic constraints, they're well connected through their bus system, their rail system, and so on. And so the innovation does happen in these industrial places. This is where Steve Jobs bought his very first computer board. Before he launched Mac, and they still sell vacuum tubes there. People haven't bought these things in 40 years, and the owner there says, well, just in case anyone has one that goes wrong, we have them here. Somebody has to have them. This is the one place in the world you can buy some of these old pieces of equipment. Fry's Electronics, big electronic megastores like Best Buy, except they have like computer parts and electronic components, as well as air mattresses, and the largest coffee maker section I've ever seen in the world, which makes a lot of sense when you talk about innovation. And really, I wanted to pop that up because you'll learn a lot about how some places are great and lend themselves to innovation. London is a much more walkable space than Silicon Valley is. But we're not Silicon Valley. Boston's more walkable and is very innovative. Silicon Valley is less walkable, but has different kind of mass transit and different stores and different types of university. Much more open culture. You walk through Harvard's main campus, and you'll walk 20 feet and you'll get a hand on your shoulder saying, "Do you have a student card? Or are you supposed to be here?" In Stanford, I didn't find a single locked door. You could just walk around the whole campus and walk into offices and talk to people, and they had no issue with that. It was just amazing open culture. So the culture really matters. It's culture and place. And sometimes it's policy, and this is the point of this talk, that brings it all together. So I know you guys are probably, this is just about wrapped up, or you guys have to run, but any other questions? I can stick around for a couple minutes if anybody wants to chat after.
I guess I just got one quick question. So I guess the natural question after that is, so why Silicon Valley? Why do you think it's become the kind of mecca of
there's a couple reasons. One, it was one of the first places where Fred Terman at Stanford, the Dean of Engineering, really encouraged startup creation before people even knew what startups were. So it was one of the first places where this kind of like high-tech culture blossomed. Stanford's one of the top 3 universities in the world, so a lot of research. Part of the secret history of Silicon Valley and Steve Blank's thesis is the military complex there. There's a lot of military investment that you don't typically hear about, but I could show you pictures of walking by Lockheed Martin and all these other places that had a lot of significant, research-intensive military stuff there as well, and satellites and things like that. So a lot of investment went in, a lot of government investment went in. Then the culture started there, and I think they had a little bit of first mover advantage. And at this point, Silicon Valley is up here, and then you've got maybe like a Boston and and a handful of other places, and then you've got everybody else down here, but they're still way up here. No one is going to be a Silicon Valley. Somewhere in the world is going to be the disproportional leader to the rest, but they have blind spots as well. If you go to the Valley and you've got an opportunity that has a $5 billion market opportunity, that's way too small. That's not very interesting. That's okay. I'll invest in that. I'll get involved with an idea that's that big. They don't invest in things like medical devices, and we've got a vaccine for AIDS being developed here at Western and up at the research park, and cures for diabetes. They don't do that down in the Valley because they're so focused on the latest apps, because they can get the most profit the fastest that way. And some of those things are transformative, but if they have blind spots on, and if you go out and cure the world of cancer, you're going to do pretty well for yourself. So we can do things here in London, Ontario, or in Toronto, or I went to a conference a couple weeks ago in Memphis, Tennessee, called the Everywhere Else Conference. There was 2,000 people there. It was the largest startup conference in North America. And they were from Columbus, Ohio, and Indianapolis, and South Carolina, and Texas, everywhere else other than Silicon Valley and the usual suspects. And they were all creating incredible things. And in many cases, they were creating things that really mattered. Financial industry, agriculture, biotech, medical devices, educational software, things that are not quite as profitable as what happens in the Valley, but that are going to really transform the world when they're successful. So, anything else?
No? Thank you.
Well, thank you.